Signs by Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Quotes. Signs by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, published in 1960, is a collection of essays exploring various intersections of philosophy, politics, language, art, and human existence. Through a phenomenological approach, Merleau-Ponty delves into the complexities of perception, expression, and historical consciousness. The essays in this book engage with topics ranging from Marxism and existentialism to the nature of language and the human body. Merleau-Ponty examines how individuals relate to the world and one another through embodied experience, emphasizing the inescapable ambiguity of human life and our ongoing quest to make meaning. Written in the shadow of World War II and the rise of global political movements, Signs captures the intellectual tension between historical determinism and human freedom. Merleau-Ponty's reflections in this work reveal his deep concern for the role of philosophy in responding to the crises of his time, as well as his commitment to revealing the subtle, often overlooked signs of meaning in the flux of everyday life. Quote 1. Language is learned, and in this sense, one is certainly obliged to go from part to whole. The prior whole, which Saussure is talking about, cannot be the explicit and articulated whole of complete language as it is recorded in grammars and dictionaries. The quote highlights that language acquisition is a process where individuals move from smaller linguistic components to understanding the broader structure. Saussure's view suggests that language is more than just a sum of its parts, as described in formal linguistic tools like grammars. Instead, it operates as a system of relations and differences between signs that is gradually comprehended through experience and use, rather than theoretical explanation. Quote 2. Since the sign has meaning only insofar as it is profiled against other signs, its meaning is entirely involved in language. Speech always comes into play against a background of speech. It is always only a fold in the immense fabric of language. This passage emphasizes that the meaning of a sign depends on its context and relationship with other signs. Language is not a collection of isolated elements, but a continuous and interconnected system. Speech acts are not standalone, but participate in a larger, dynamic language structure, where meaning is produced through interaction rather than isolated tokens. Quote 3. If this account is true, the writer's act of expression is not very different from the painter's. Here, the analogy between writing and painting suggests that both involve a process of creation, where meaning or expression is not pre-existing, but emerges through the act itself. Just as a painter composes meaning through color and form, a writer constructs meaning through the organization of words, implying that both arts share a fundamental creative spontaneity. Quote 4. It is as if each step called for another step and made it possible, or as if each successful expression prescribed another task to the spiritual automaton and founded an institution whose efficacy it will never stop experiencing. This reflects on the iterative nature of creative work. In both artistic and linguistic creation, each accomplishment or expression naturally leads to further exploration and development. The process is cumulative and self-perpetuating, with each success laying the groundwork for subsequent acts of creation, forming a continuous progression. Quote 5. Even when the painter has already painted, and even if he has become in some respects master of himself, what is given to him with his style is not a manner, a certain number of procedures or tics that he can inventory, but a mode of formulation that is just as recognizable for others and just as little visible to him as his silhouette or his everyday gestures. This quote suggests that an artist's style, much like a person's everyday habits, becomes second nature. While it is clearly identifiable by others, the artist himself may not be fully aware of its presence or significance as it emerges naturally from his creative practice, rather than through conscious effort or technique. Quote 6. Malraux says so in his best passages. Perception already stylizes. A woman passing by is not first and foremost a corporeal contour for me, a colored mannequin, or a spectacle. She is an individual, sentimental, sexual expression. This quote suggests that perception is not merely a mechanical process of recognizing physical shapes or colors. Instead, it is already imbued with meaning, as individuals perceive the world through the lens of emotions and experiences. In the example of a woman passing by, her presence evokes a deeper, personal response shaped by one's own awareness of being and embodiment, and this interpretation precedes any detached, objective description of her form. Quote 7. For the painter, and even for us, if we set ourselves to living in the painting, the meaning is much more than a wave of heat at the surface of the canvas, since it is capable of demanding that color and that object in preference to all others, and since it commands the arrangement of a painting just as imperiously as a syntax or a logic. This quote highlights how the painter's interaction with their medium goes beyond surface impressions. The meaning of a painting is not superficial, but embedded deeply within the choices made by the artist. Every color, every form is selected purposefully to create a coherent whole. This process is akin to constructing a sentence or following a logical framework, where each element must fit together to convey the intended message. Quote 8. A vision or an action that is finally free throws out of focus and regroups objects of the world for the painter and words for the poet. This passage emphasizes the liberating nature of creative expression. Whether through painting or poetry, true artistic freedom allows the creator to break away from conventional representations of the world, reimagining and reorganizing objects and words in a way that expresses their personal vision. This reordering of reality enables the artist to communicate new meanings and insights that go beyond the ordinary. Quote 9. To live in painting is still to breathe the air of this world, above all, for the man who sees something in the world to paint, and there is a little of him in every man. Here, the act of painting is described as deeply connected to lived experience. For the artist, painting is not an escape from the world, but a way of engaging with it. The artist draws inspiration from everyday life, and in doing so, reveals that the creative impulse exists in everyone, as we all interact with and interpret the world around us. Quote 10. Cultural creation is ineffectual if it does not find a vehicle in external circumstances. But if circumstances lend themselves in the least to creation, a preserved and transmitted painting develops a suggestive power in its inheritors which is without proportion to what it is, not only as a bit of painted canvas, but even as a work endowed by its creator with a definite signification. This quote explores the relationship between art and external conditions. While cultural creations must be grounded in the world, they transcend their physical form and original context. A painting may begin as a simple object, but over time, it accumulates layers of meaning that resonate with future generations, far beyond what the artist initially intended, showing the lasting impact of art on culture and perception. Quote 11. We may speak of a unity of human style which transcends spatial and temporal distances to bring the gestures of painters together in one single effort to express, and their works into a single cumulative history, a single art. This quote suggests that art, especially painting, forms a continuous tradition where individual contributions across time and space are united by a shared human impulse to express. Despite the temporal and geographical differences, the gestures of painters converge into a unified history. Each painter's work is part of a larger, ongoing artistic endeavor that spans generations and transcends individual life experiences. Quote 12. The history of painting, which runs from one work to another, rests upon itself and is born only by the caryatid of our efforts, which converge by the sole fact that they are efforts to express. The history of art is described as a chain of interconnected works, each linked to the next, not by external forces, but by the artist's shared pursuit of expression. The weight of this history is carried by the collective efforts of artists whose individual contributions build upon one another. This dynamic process forms the foundation of painting's development as an ongoing narrative. Quote 13. The continued attempt at expression founds one single history, as the hold our body has upon every possible object founds one single space. This quote highlights the idea that human expression, much like our bodily interaction with space, creates a singular, coherent history. Just as our bodies interact with and navigate the world as one unified space, our attempts at artistic expression contribute to a single, continuous historical and cultural development. It underscores the unity of artistic and human history through the act of creation. Quote 14. What is irreplaceable in the work of art? What makes it far more a voice of the spirit, whose analogue is found in all productive philosophic or political thought, than a means to pleasure? The fact that it contains, better than ideas, matrices of ideas. The fact that it provides us with symbols whose meaning we never stop developing. This quote emphasizes that the value of art lies not in providing immediate pleasure or superficial meaning, but in its ability to offer deep, ongoing intellectual and spiritual engagement. Art gives us symbols and ideas that continue to evolve and provoke thought long after their creation, making it a profound vehicle for human understanding and reflection. Quote 15. Language is not just the replacement of one meaning by another, but the substitution of equivalent meanings. The new structure is given as already present in the old. The latter subsists in it, and the past is now understood. This passage reflects on the nature of language as a system where new meanings emerge from the old, without completely erasing them. Language is an evolving structure where every new expression builds on previous meanings, creating an ongoing dialogue between past and present, deepening our understanding of both. Quote 16. It is in the same fashion that the spoken word, the one I utter or the one I hear, is pregnant with a meaning which can be read in the very texture of the linguistic gesture, and yet is never contained in that gesture. This quote emphasizes that the meaning of spoken language is not fully encapsulated by the words or sounds themselves. Instead, meaning arises from the interaction between the speaker, listener, and the context in which the language is used. The words merely point to something beyond themselves, a deeper significance that cannot be wholly grasped by focusing solely on the words as isolated units. Quote 17. For the speaking subject, to express is to become aware of. He does not express just for others, but also to know himself what he intends. In this quote, speech is portrayed as a means of self-discovery. When someone speaks, they are not only communicating with others, but also clarifying their own thoughts and intentions. Through the act of expression, the speaker comes to understand their own ideas more fully, using language to give shape to previously unformed or unclear thoughts. Quote 18. Expression is never total. As Saussure points out, we have the feeling that our language expresses totally. But it is not because it expresses totally that it is ours. It is because it is ours that we believe it expresses totally. This quote highlights the illusion of completeness in language. We often feel that our language fully captures our thoughts, but this is a subjective belief rooted in our ownership of the language. In reality, no language can fully express the complexity of meaning. The idea that our language is sufficient is shaped by our familiarity and comfort with it, rather than its actual expressive capacity. Quote 19. The reason why the thematization of the signified does not precede speech is that it is the result of it. This quote challenges the notion that we first form clear ideas in our minds and then find words to express them. Instead, it suggests that the process of speech itself brings ideas into focus. The act of speaking shapes and defines the thoughts, rather than merely communicating preformed concepts, indicating the dynamic relationship between language and thought. Quote 20. Speech, as distinguished from language, is that moment when the significative intention proves itself capable of incorporating itself into my culture and the culture of others, of shaping me and others by transforming the meaning of cultural instruments. Here, the distinction between speech and language is drawn. speech is presented as an active, transformative process through which new meanings are introduced into culture. It is not merely a mechanical use of language, but an expression that reshapes both the speaker and the cultural framework, allowing language to evolve and adapt as it incorporates new ideas and significations. Quote 21. We need neither tear down the behavioral sciences to lay the foundations of philosophy, nor tear down philosophy to lay the foundations of the behavioral sciences. This quote emphasizes that philosophy and the behavioral sciences, such as sociology, are not mutually exclusive fields, but are instead interdependent. Both can coexist and contribute to knowledge without undermining each other. Rather than viewing them as competing domains, they should be seen as complementary, each enriching the other's understanding of human existence and society. Quote 22. Segregation is Cold War. This statement vividly portrays the separation between philosophy and sociology as a form of intellectual standoff. The isolation of these disciplines from each other leads to stagnation and misunderstanding, preventing a fruitful dialogue. The division between ideas and empirical facts is likened to a Cold War, underscoring the destructive consequences of maintaining rigid boundaries between them. Quote 23. Present speech casts light, which is not found in any merely possible expression. It is the operation in our linguistic field of presence, which, far from being a particular case of other possible systems of expression, serves as a model for conceiving of them. Here, the text emphasizes that speech, as it happens in the present moment, carries a unique significance that goes beyond abstract or hypothetical language systems. Present speech is dynamic and engaged with lived reality, providing a foundational model for understanding language as a whole. It is through this immediacy that we come to grasp the full meaning of linguistic expression. Quote 24. It is essential never to cut sociological inquiry off from our experience of social subjects. This quote highlights the importance of grounding sociological research in the lived experiences of individuals. Social facts and structures cannot be understood solely through objective observation. They must be connected to the subjective experiences and interactions of people within society. By anchoring sociology in human experience, it becomes a more complete and meaningful study of social life. Quote 25. Philosophy does not possess the truth about language and the world from the start, but is rather the recuperation and first formulation of a logos scattered out in our world and our life, and bound to their concrete structures. This passage suggests that philosophy is not the starting point for truth, but a process of rediscovering and articulating meaning that is already embedded in the world and in human experience. Truth and understanding are dispersed throughout everyday life, and philosophy works to gather these fragments into a coherent expression. This shifts the focus of philosophy from abstract theorizing to engaging with the concrete realities of existence. Quote 26. The same dependence upon history which inhibits the philosopher from arrogating to himself an immediate access to the universal or the eternal prohibits the sociologist from taking the philosopher's place in this function and giving ontological value to the scientific objectification of the social. This quote suggests that both philosophy and sociology are grounded in their historical contexts and cannot claim an unmediated grasp of universal truths. While the philosopher is bound by the limitations of his historical moment, the sociologist is similarly constrained and cannot replace the philosopher's role in understanding deeper truths about existence and society. Both fields must recognize the historical contingency of their insights. Quote 27. If I have once recognized that through it, I am grafted onto every action and all knowledge which can have a meaning for me, and that step by step it contains everything which can exist for me, then my contact with the social in the finitude of my situation is revealed to me as the point of origin of all truth, including scientific truth. In this passage, the realization that one's historical situation is not just a limitation, but also the source of all meaningful knowledge is emphasized. The finite and specific context in which a person exists provides the foundation for understanding both social realities and scientific knowledge. By engaging with one's situatedness, one gains access to the truths that emerge from that position, transforming the limitations of the situation into a generative source of knowledge. Quote 28. When I discover that the social is not simply an object, but to begin with my situation, and when I awaken within myself the consciousness of this social, which is mine, then my whole synchrony becomes present to me. This quote explains that social reality is not an external object to be studied in isolation, but is intricately tied to one's own lived experience. The social world is part of the individual's situation, and awakening to this awareness brings an understanding of the interconnectedness between personal and collective existence. The realization of this deep connection reveals the synchronic, or simultaneous, presence of both individual and societal histories in the present moment. Quote 29. Philosophy is nature in us, the others in us, and we in them. This statement encapsulates the idea that philosophy is not an abstract or isolated pursuit, but is deeply intertwined with the natural world and the lives of others. Philosophy reflects the interconnectedness of existence, showing how we carry nature and other people within us, just as we are present within them. It speaks to the fundamental unity between self, others, and the world that philosophy seeks to explore and understand. Quote 30. Philosophy is not a particular body of knowledge. It is the vigilance which does not let us forget the source of all knowledge. Philosophy, in this view, is not about accumulating a specific set of facts or theories, but about maintaining an awareness of the deeper origins of knowledge. It serves as a continual reminder of where knowledge comes from, ensuring that we remain connected to the fundamental sources of meaning and understanding in human experience, rather than becoming lost in the mechanics of knowledge production. Quote 31. Social facts, it was said, were representations. It was just that instead of being individual, they were collective. This quote suggests that social facts, while once considered personal or individual, are understood in sociology as collective phenomena. They represent the shared ideas, values, and practices of a society, extending beyond individual experiences. This collective aspect means that social facts are not reducible to personal or psychological experiences, but exist within a broader, shared social consciousness. Quote 32. The exchange would not be an effect of society, but society itself in act. Here, exchange is described as more than a social transaction. It is society in motion. The act of exchanging goods, services, or symbols is not just a byproduct of societal structures. It is the essence of those structures in action. Society is continually formed and reformed through these exchanges, which embody the relationships and bonds between individuals. Quote 33. Structure, like Janus, has two faces. On one side, it organizes its constituent parts according to an internal principle. It is meaning. This passage highlights the dual nature of social structures. One face of the structure organizes its elements and gives them meaning, while the other face shows how this structure operates within a broader system. It is through this internal organization that the parts of society find coherence and meaning, even as they exist within a larger, interconnected framework. Quote 34. It is sound practice to envision at the limit the program of a universal code of structures, which would allow us to deduce them from one another by means of rules of transformation. This quote suggests the possibility of developing a universal system that could explain different social structures through common rules and principles. By understanding the transformations that link various systems, such a universal code could provide insights into the underlying patterns of human societies, much like a periodic table in chemistry helps to explain the elements. Quote 35. Man and society are not exactly outside of nature and the biological. They distinguish themselves from them by bringing all the stakes together and risking them all together. This statement illustrates that while human societies and cultures are distinct from purely natural or biological systems, they still operate within a shared framework. Humans, through their symbolic and social activities, bring together and take risks on aspects of life, integrating both nature and culture. This process differentiates humans from other species, but it also highlights the interconnectedness of all living systems. Quote 36. Their access to the timeless is no museum entrance. They endure with their truths and follies as total undertakings, or they do not endure at all. This quote reflects the idea that the longevity of past philosophical ideas is not guaranteed by their pure eternal truths alone. Philosophies survive because they were total engagements with the world, embodying both profound insights and inevitable flaws. Philosophical doctrines live on as complete endeavors, including their imperfections, or they do not survive at all. Quote 37. It is true that during the last 20 centuries of Western philosophy, Christian themes have persisted. And perhaps in the case of Oriental philosophy too, it is necessary to be in a civilization in order to perceive movement and history beneath the appearance of stagnation. This statement acknowledges that, while Western philosophy has been deeply influenced by enduring Christian themes, the same might be said of Oriental philosophy. To fully understand the development and dynamic nature of any philosophical tradition, one must immerse oneself in its civilization. What might seem stagnant from an outsider's perspective could, upon closer engagement, reveal a rich historical and intellectual evolution. Quote 38. The turnings which made straight the way for Hegelian philosophy are not completed. They are still permissible. More than that, they are necessary. They are the way, and truth is only the memory of all that has been found along the way. This passage highlights the unfinished and ongoing nature of philosophical inquiry. The paths taken by earlier thinkers remain open and necessary, even if Hegel's system claims to have surpassed them. Truth, in this sense, is not a fixed endpoint, but a continuous process, built upon the accumulated insights and discoveries of previous philosophies. Quote 39. Philosophy is everywhere, even in the facts, and nowhere has a private realm which shelters it from life's contagion. This quote emphasizes that philosophy cannot exist in isolation from life's realities. It is not confined to a particular domain or untouched by the challenges of existence. Instead, philosophy is embedded in the facts of life, continually influenced by and responding to the conditions of human experience. There is no separate, untouched realm where philosophy operates independently of life's ongoing events. Quote 40. A philosophy is not chosen like an object. Choice does not suppress what is not chosen, but sustains it marginally. This passage suggests that when a philosophical path is chosen, it does not mean that other possible ideas are entirely dismissed or eradicated. Instead, those unchosen paths still linger at the edges of thought, exerting subtle influence. Philosophy is an ongoing engagement with ideas, where even those that are not the main focus continue to inform and shape the thinker's approach, sustaining the complexity of thought. Quote 41. The Orient's childishness has something to teach us, if it were nothing more than the narrowness of our adult ideas. This quote challenges the Western assumption of intellectual superiority over the East by suggesting that what is often dismissed as childish in Oriental thought could reveal the limitations of Western rationalism. The comparison with childlike simplicity hints at a broader, perhaps more flexible approach to understanding life and existence, offering the West a way to reconsider its own intellectual boundaries. Quote 42. We cannot see in the name of what this projecting thought would refuse the title of philosophy to individual or imaginative modes of expression and reserve it for doctrines of the intemporal and immanent word, which are themselves placed above history. This quote questions the exclusivity of philosophical labels, arguing that philosophy should not be restricted to formal doctrines that claim eternal, unchanging truth. Imaginative or individual expressions of thought, which are deeply intertwined with history and life, should also be considered as valid forms of philosophical engagement. The passage advocates for a broader, more inclusive understanding of what constitutes philosophy. Quote 43. Our philosophical problem is to open up the concept without destroying it. This passage highlights the delicate task of modern philosophy, to expand the boundaries of traditional concepts and ways of thinking without completely dismantling or losing their significance. It calls for a philosophy that remains open to new interpretations and developments, while still preserving the core meaning and value of its foundational ideas. The challenge is to innovate without abandoning the essential structure of philosophical inquiry. Quote 44. The 17th century is that privileged moment when natural science and metaphysics believed they had discovered a common foundation. This quote refers to a time in history when science and philosophy were thought to be perfectly aligned, both seeking to explain the world through a unified approach. During this period, philosophers and scientists believed they could study nature without diminishing the metaphysical truths about existence. The harmony between these fields allowed thinkers to explore both physical and spiritual realities without seeing them as opposed or mutually exclusive. Quote 45. There is also the being of the subject or the soul, the being of ideas, and the interrelations of these ideas, the inner relation of truth. And the latter universe is as extensive as the former, or rather it encompasses it. This passage highlights the importance of subjective or internal realities, such as thoughts and ideas, as equally significant as the external physical world. It asserts that the inner realm of ideas and truth is not separate from the material world, but rather includes and surpasses it. The subjective dimension, our thoughts, consciousness, and truths, forms a comprehensive part of reality, interacting with and containing the external world. Quote 46. What separates us from the 17th century is not a decline, but a growth of consciousness and experience. This quote reflects the idea that modern thought has evolved beyond the intellectual harmony of the 17th century. Rather than a regression, the shift represents an increased awareness of complexity in science, philosophy, and life. This heightened consciousness means that contemporary thinkers must grapple with deeper uncertainties, challenges, and nuances that were not fully recognized in earlier centuries, marking progress rather than decay. Quote 47. We neither can nor will be able to set ourselves up at the center of physical or even mathematical entities, but must gropingly inspect them from without, approaching them by oblique processes and questioning them like persons. This passage explains that modern thought cannot claim to have absolute knowledge of the universe. Instead, we must acknowledge that our understanding is always partial and indirect, and our relationship to the world requires careful inquiry and exploration. The comparison to questioning like persons suggests that knowledge is dialogical and emergent, formed through ongoing interaction with the world rather than direct mastery of it. Quote 48. There are some ideas which make it impossible for us to return to a time prior to their existence, even and especially if we have moved beyond them, and subjectivity is one of them. This quote asserts that once certain philosophical ideas, like the concept of subjectivity, have been introduced, they fundamentally alter our understanding of the world. Even if we attempt to move beyond them, their influence remains. Subjectivity, or the recognition of the self as central to understanding, permanently transforms philosophical thought, making it impossible to revert to pre-subjective ways of thinking. Quote 49. Establishing a tradition means forgetting its origins, the aging Husserl used to say. Precisely because we owe so much to tradition, we are in no position to see just what belongs to it. This quote suggests that as traditions become established and solidified, their original intent or source may be obscured or forgotten. Over time, people focus on the outcomes or systems that emerge from traditions, but lose sight of the nuances and insights that gave rise to them. In this way, tradition both sustains and distances us from the foundational thoughts that initially shaped it. Quote 50. To think is not to possess the objects of thought. It is to use them to mark out a realm, to think about which we therefore are not yet thinking about. This passage highlights the nature of thought as an exploratory process. Rather than simply owning or fully understanding the objects of thought, thinking opens up new areas of inquiry and unknown possibilities. Thought does not reach a final, fixed understanding, but instead continuously gestures toward further exploration and discovery of things that have not yet been fully understood. Quote 51. Reflection speaks of our natural relationship to the world as an attitude, that is, as an organized totality of acts. But this is a reflection which presupposes that it is in things and which sees no farther than itself. This quote points out that reflection, while it may seem to analyze the world from a detached perspective, is always embedded within the world itself. Reflection assumes it can objectively organize thoughts and acts, but in doing so, it limits itself by not seeing beyond its own methods. This demonstrates the paradox that reflection, while aiming for distance, is still part of the very world it reflects upon. Quote 52. We do not live naturally in the universe of Blossessahen. Prior to all reflection, in conversation and the practices of life, we maintain a personalist attitude that naturalism cannot account for. This passage emphasizes that human life, before theoretical reflection or scientific objectification, is lived in a deeply personal and relational way. Our experiences in everyday life are not simply about objective facts or things in themselves, Blossessachen, but involve a personal, subjective engagement with the world, which is something that pure naturalism or scientific perspectives cannot fully explain. Quote 53. The other person becomes actual when a different comportment and a different gaze take possession of my things. Here, the existence of another person is realized when they interact with the world in ways similar to ourselves. The presence of others is not something we mentally project, but something we perceive directly when they engage with shared objects and spaces. This process of mutual recognition is fundamental to understanding others as independent subjects, just as we understand ourselves. Quote 54. The problem of Einfühlung, like that of my incarnation, opens onto a meditation of sensible being. This quote introduces the idea that empathy, Einfühlung, and incarnation are not merely intellectual concepts, but are deeply rooted in the experience of sensory existence. It suggests that understanding others and being in the world are grounded in the physical, sensory aspects of life. The body and its ability to perceive and feel become essential to how we connect with the world and others, making sensory being a central concern for philosophical reflection. Quote 55. Sensible being is not only things, but also everything sketched out there, even virtually. Everything which leaves its trace there. Everything which figures there, even as divergence and a certain absence. This passage highlights that the sensory world includes not just tangible objects, but also things that are only hinted at or partially perceived. These traces, virtual presences, and absences are as much a part of reality as concrete objects. Sensory experience involves more than what is immediately visible or present, pointing to a broader and more complex understanding of existence. Quote 56. The other person's soul is soul in my eyes through his body. This quote emphasizes the importance of the body in understanding and relating to others. It suggests that the way we perceive the soul or inner life of another person is mediated through their physical body. The body, therefore, is not just a vessel for the soul, but an integral part of how we experience and recognize another person's existence and subjectivity. Quote 57. All of constitution is anticipated in the fulguration of Urempfindung. This statement underscores the foundational role of primal sensation, Urempfindung, in the process of constitution, or how we come to experience and understand the world. It suggests that the most basic sensory experiences already contain within them the seeds of all further understanding and interpretation, making primal sensation a critical moment in the unfolding of consciousness and perception. Quote 58. We cannot do away with the earth. As the earth is by definition one, all soil we tread upon becoming simultaneously a province of it, the living beings with whom the sons of the earth will be able to communicate will simultaneously become men. This quote reflects on the inescapable unity of the earth as the foundational ground for all human experience. It suggests that no matter how far we travel or what we discover, we remain connected to the earth, which serves as the common ground for all life. The earth is not just a physical space, but the matrix that defines and connects human beings across time and space. Quote 59. Bergson did not wait to know where his path was leading in order to take it, or rather, to make it. This quote reflects Bergson's commitment to philosophy as a process of discovery and creation. He did not begin his work with a predetermined destination in mind, but allowed his ideas to develop organically. His philosophical journey was one of forging new paths, rather than following established ones, embodying the courage to pursue truth without certainty of the outcome. Quote 60. We cannot have truth without risks. If we begin our search for truth with an eye for conclusions, there is no more philosophy. Here, the quote highlights the inherent uncertainty in the philosophical search for truth. Philosophy, according to Bergson, requires a willingness to embrace risk and uncertainty. If one begins with predetermined conclusions or seeks only to confirm existing beliefs, true philosophical inquiry ceases to exist. The search for truth must remain open-ended and exploratory. Quote 61. Bergson disturbed, it reassures. Bergson was a conquest. Bergsonism defends and justifies Bergson. This passage contrasts the bold, unsettling nature of Bergson's original ideas with the more comfortable, established interpretations that came later. While Bergson himself challenged existing systems of thought, Bergsonism became a way to defend and explain his ideas within safer, more conventional frameworks. The dynamic, challenging aspects of his philosophy were softened by its later institutionalization. Quote 62. Absolute knowledge is not detachment, it is inherence. This quote suggests that true understanding or knowledge is not achieved by distancing oneself from experience or reality, but by being deeply involved in it. For Bergson, absolute knowledge arises from immersion in life and existence, not from abstract, detached observation. This inherence is what allows for a profound, lived experience of truth. Quote 63. Duration is not simply change, becoming, mobility. It is being in the vital, active sense of the term. Bergson's concept of duration is presented here as more than just temporal movement or change. It is a dynamic and living state of being, characterized by vitality and activity. Time, in this view, is not separate from existence, but is intertwined with the very nature of being, constantly unfolding and developing. Duration represents the essence of life as a continuous, creative process. Quote 64. Einstein himself was a classical thinker. As categorically as he claims the right to construct, with no respect whatsoever for the a priori notions which claim to be the mind's invariant framework, he has never stopped thinking that this creation rejoins a truth set down in the world. This quote captures Einstein's dual approach to science. While he embraced speculative, creative thinking to develop new theories, he remained convinced that these theories would ultimately connect with a fundamental truth existing in the world. Einstein balanced radical innovation in scientific methods with a deep belief in an underlying rational structure to reality that his theories aimed to uncover. Quote 65. The least comprehensible thing in the world, he said, is that the world is comprehensible. This quote highlights Einstein's wonder at the fact that the universe, despite its complexity and mystery, can be understood by human minds. He recognized the paradox that while reality is vast and often elusive, it is still accessible to human reason and inquiry, leading to scientific breakthroughs that reveal its inner workings. For Einstein, the very possibility of understanding the world was both a mystery and a marvel. Quote 66. For him, humor was the mode of risky certainties. His little finger was the creative physicist's paradoxical and irrepressible consciousness of having access to a reality through an invention which was nevertheless free. This passage illustrates how Einstein used humor as a way to cope with the uncertainties of scientific discovery. His little finger symbolizes the intuitive, almost mystical sense that guided him in his groundbreaking work, allowing him to trust his speculative theories even when they seemed improbable. It shows how Einstein's creative process involved both intellectual rigor and playful acceptance of the unknown. Quote 67. The multiplicity of times I obtain in this way does not impede the unity of real time. It rather presupposes it. This quote discusses the concept of multiple times, as explored in the context of relativity. Despite the idea that different observers experience time differently depending on their frames of reference, Bergson argues that this multiplicity of times still depends on the existence of a single unified reality. The variability of time for different observers does not negate the idea that there is one overarching reality, which is the basis for all these individual experiences of time. Quote 68. The scientist will not agree to recognize any reason but the physicist's, and it is this reason he relies upon as he does upon the reason of classical science. This quote critiques the rigid adherence of some scientists to a purely scientific or physical conception of reason, rejecting other forms of understanding. By limiting reason to the domain of physics, these scientists ignore other philosophical or experiential insights into reality. This narrow view of reason, the passage suggests, can undermine the broader philosophical understanding of the world that is necessary for a fuller grasp of reality. Quote 69. Skepticism has two sides. It means that nothing is true, but also that nothing is false. This quote captures the essence of skepticism as a dual-edged approach to truth. Montaigne's skepticism does not only reject absolute truths, but also refuses to dismiss any claim entirely. By questioning everything, he opens the possibility of a more profound, multifaceted truth. Skepticism here is not purely negative, but serves as a means to explore a broader understanding of the world through continuous inquiry. Quote 70. Self-consciousness is his constant, the measure of all doctrines for him. For Montaigne, self-awareness is the foundation of all philosophical exploration. He uses his own experiences and reflections as the standard by which he evaluates all ideas. This deep focus on self-consciousness highlights Montaigne's belief that true understanding must begin with a profound knowledge of oneself before it can extend to other areas of thought. Quote 71. It is because our body and its graceful functions are traversed by the power that we have to devote ourselves to something else and give ourselves absolutes. This passage reflects on the human ability to transcend physical existence by attaching meaning and significance to things beyond the body. Montaigne recognizes that humans are driven by a power to seek something greater, often leading them to invest meaning in absolutes, ideals, or higher purposes, even when those pursuits are irrational or destructive. Quote 72. There cannot, in all good conscience, be any question of solving the human problem. There can only be a question of describing man as problematic. Montaigne rejects the notion that humanity's complexities can be fully explained or solved by philosophical systems. Instead, he embraces the idea that humans are inherently problematic, and that the task of philosophy is not to resolve this, but to explore and describe it. This approach emphasizes the open-ended, incomplete nature of understanding human existence. Quote 73. Life should have itself as its aim and design. Its proper study is to govern, conduct, and undergo itself. This quote suggests that life's purpose is not found in external goals or ideals, but in living itself. Montaigne emphasizes that the primary task of life is to navigate and experience it as it unfolds, managing its challenges and embracing its complexities. Rather than seeking meaning outside of life, the focus should be on life's immediate experience and self-governance. Quote 74. There is no true freedom without risk. Here, Montaigne asserts that genuine freedom involves stepping into uncertainty and embracing the risks that come with living authentically. He challenges the notion of safety and security as the highest values, instead emphasizing that to live fully and freely, one must accept vulnerability and the potential for loss. Freedom, for Montaigne, is inseparable from the courage to face life's unpredictability. Quote 75. He describes that knot of collective life in which pure morality can be cruel, and pure politics requires something like a morality. This quote reflects the complexity of Machiavelli's understanding of the intersection between morality and politics. Machiavelli reveals the tension where strict morality might lead to cruelty, and the practice of politics requires a certain kind of morality that balances action and ethics. His ideas challenge the conventional separation of morality and politics, suggesting that political action often requires difficult, ethically ambiguous choices that do not fit within the bounds of pure moral reasoning. Quote 76. While men are trying not to be afraid, they begin to make themselves feared by others, and they transfer to others the aggression that they push back from themselves. Machiavelli's insight into human nature suggests that the desire to overcome personal fear often results in projecting aggression onto others. By attempting to control their own fear, people inflict fear and suffering on others, creating a cycle of aggression. This quote points to the paradox of power, where individuals, in their attempts to protect themselves, perpetuate violence and fear in a broader social context. Quote 77. There is no power which has an absolute basis. There is only a crystallization of opinion, which tolerates power, accepting it as acquired. This quote challenges the idea of inherent legitimacy in power. Machiavelli asserts that power is sustained not through absolute authority, but through a consensus, a fragile agreement that can dissolve at any moment. Power exists because it is accepted by the people, but this acceptance is conditional, based on opinion rather than any intrinsic right. The stability of power is, therefore, always at risk of collapse. Quote 78. A man who wants to be perfectly honest among dishonest people cannot fail to perish sooner or later. Machiavelli highlights the dangers of being too morally rigid in a corrupt world. This quote suggests that in a society where dishonesty prevails, those who insist on adhering strictly to moral principles will inevitably face destruction. This pragmatism reflects Machiavelli's belief that in politics, survival sometimes requires compromising moral ideals in order to navigate the realities of power and human behavior. Quote 79. It is better to be too bold than too circumspect, because fortune is a woman. She gives in only to violence and boldness. This quote personifies fortune as a woman who favors those who take risks and act boldly. Machiavelli suggests that success in life, and particularly in politics, often comes from decisive, courageous action rather than cautious deliberation. His philosophy advocates for boldness and taking charge of circumstances, as fortune rewards those who dare to assert their will, even in the face of uncertainty. Quote 80. Our century has wiped out the dividing line between body and mind, and sees human life as through and through mental and corporeal. This statement reflects the modern understanding of human existence as an inseparable blend of the mental and physical. The traditional dualism that placed mind and body in opposition has been replaced with a view that recognizes how deeply intertwined they are. Human life is both mental and bodily at every level, with no clear division between the two. This perspective emphasizes the complexity and unity of human experience. Quote 81. Freud tries to show that in human life there is no inferior or lower part. Thus, we could not be further from an explanation in terms of the lower part. Here, Freud's approach to psychoanalysis is highlighted as one that refuses to reduce human behavior to merely biological or instinctual drives. Instead, Freud shows that all aspects of human life, including those traditionally considered base or lower, have meaning and significance. This challenges older models that compartmentalized human experiences into higher and lower categories, suggesting instead that all behaviors are part of a cohesive psychological system. Quote 82. Language is no longer the servant of significations, but the act of signifying itself, and the writer or man speaking no longer has to control it voluntarily, any more than living man has to premeditate the means or details of his gestures. This quote captures a shift in the understanding of language, where it is no longer viewed merely as a tool for communicating pre-existing ideas. Instead, language becomes an active process of meaning-making in itself. Writers do not consciously control every aspect of language, just as people do not consciously plan every gesture. They inhabit language, letting it flow naturally as an expression of their being. Quote 83. The very men who think themselves adversaries are reconciled in the eyes of a third person who witnesses them, because they are responding to a single cultural situation. This passage suggests that even thinkers who view themselves as opponents are part of a larger cultural conversation that unites them. From an external perspective, these adversaries are linked by the shared historical and cultural context they are responding to. While they may disagree on specific ideas, they are shaped by the same cultural forces, making their opposition part of a broader, interconnected dialogue. Quote 84. A man cannot receive a heritage of ideas without transforming it by the very fact that he comes to know it, without injecting his own and always different way of being into it. This quote reflects on the inevitability of transformation when one engages with inherited ideas. As individuals come to understand and adopt concepts from the past, they alter them by virtue of their own unique perspectives and experiences. The act of receiving knowledge is never passive, as each person integrates their distinct way of thinking into the ideas, thus creating something new. Quote 85. There was no world politics. Forces did not confront one another. This quote describes a historical moment when global political forces were not directly in conflict, creating a period of relative calm and transition. During this time, questions remained unresolved, but the absence of direct confrontation allowed for a temporary balance. The passage suggests that such moments, while appearing peaceful, are marked by underlying tensions that may eventually erupt into conflict. Quote 86. Each gesture of our body or our language, each act of political life, as we have seen, spontaneously takes account of the other person and goes beyond itself in its singular aspects toward a universal meaning. This passage emphasizes the idea that human actions, whether physical, linguistic, or political, inherently consider others and reach beyond individual intentions. Every gesture or act is connected to a broader universal meaning that transcends personal experience. The interconnectedness of human actions highlights the relational nature of existence, where every movement contributes to a larger collective understanding. Quote 87. There is no longer anything decorous or decorative about today's humanism. It no longer loves man in opposition to his body, mind in opposition to its language, values in opposition to facts. This quote illustrates a shift in humanism toward a more grounded, realistic perspective. Modern humanism no longer separates or elevates certain aspects of humanity, such as the mind over the body or values over facts. Instead, it embraces the complexities and contradictions of human existence, recognizing the integration of all elements of life as equally important and inseparable. Quote 88. The problem is not to assign absolute value to our side and deny any value to the other. It is to understand the conditions under which these values have come to be transformed into their opposites. This quote emphasizes the complexity of political ideologies and the danger of viewing one's position as absolutely right, while dismissing the opposition as entirely wrong. It suggests that values on both sides of a political divide can transform into their opposites under certain conditions. Understanding these transformations is more important than rigidly defending one side, as the dynamics of power and belief often lead to unexpected shifts in what is considered morally or politically right. Quote 89. What is terrifying in the other is not the arbitrary excess of his hatred, but the fact that it is not arbitrary, that it has its reasons, and that those reasons are well known to us. This passage highlights the unsettling nature of political opposition and conflict. The real terror in facing an enemy or an opposing ideology comes not from senseless hatred, but from the fact that this hatred is rooted in reasons and justifications that we ourselves recognize. It points to the uncomfortable truth that the rationale behind conflict is often shared or understood by both sides, making it harder to dismiss the other as irrational or entirely wrong. Quote 90. The force of circumstances has swept away the original motives and transformed what was a conscious action into an unconscious, unreflective process. This quote suggests that over time, political and social actions can lose their original meaning and become automatic or mechanical. What once may have been deliberate and reflective decisions turn into routine behaviors driven by external forces. It reflects on how ideologies and political movements can become detached from their initial intentions, continuing forward as unconscious processes shaped more by circumstances than by conscious thought. Quote 91. Paranoia consists in taking literally the myths in which people live and moving from the hypothesis of a secret to the hypothesis of a plot. Here, paranoia is described as the mental state in which individuals take symbolic or metaphorical ideas as literal truths, leading them to believe in conspiracies or plots. It points to the danger of interpreting the myths and narratives that shape political and social life as hidden truths, causing people to view the world through a lens of suspicion and fear. This distortion of perception fuels paranoid politics, where every event is seen as part of a grand, hidden scheme. Quote 92. The crisis of political thought today stems from the fact that those who claim to be on the side of revolution have no idea how to conduct one, and those who claim to be on the side of order are unable to maintain it. This quote speaks to the broader failure of political ideologies in the modern world. Revolutionary movements no longer know how to bring about meaningful change, while those in power struggle to maintain the stability and order they claim to uphold. Both sides are caught in a crisis where their stated goals are beyond their reach, leading to a state of political confusion and ineffectiveness. Quote 93. Marxism has always agreed that cultural values, like everything else, are integrally related to social history, but it has never maintained that there is a one-to-one parallel between the two developments. This quote reflects Marxism's view of culture as deeply interconnected with social and historical processes, yet not directly or simply determined by them. Marxism acknowledges that literature and art do not merely mirror political changes in a straightforward way. Instead, cultural forms have their own complexities and developments, and their relationship to social history is nuanced rather than purely deterministic. Quote 94. Today's communism, on the contrary, behaves as if there were no longer any intrinsic criteria in cultural matters, as if literature and science were means, among others, to immediate political action, which is itself understood simply as the defense of the USSR. This quote critiques contemporary communism for reducing cultural fields like literature and science to tools for political purposes, specifically in the service of the Soviet state. It suggests that the richness of cultural expression has been overshadowed by the immediate political needs of defending the USSR, thereby neglecting any deeper, intrinsic value in these fields that exists beyond immediate political utility. Quote 95. Lukács' autocriticism, as defined in 1946, was a fact of culture. In today's sense, it is the negation of it. This passage highlights how the concept of autocriticism, originally seen as a means for intellectual and personal growth, has been co-opted and hollowed out in the context of communism. What once was a way for writers like Lukács to reflect on and develop their ideas has become a mere instrument of political discipline, stripping away the richness and ambiguity that once defined cultural self-criticism. Thus, quote 96, communism goes from historical responsibility to naked discipline, from autocriticism to repudiation, from Marxism to superstition. This quote traces the decline of communism from a movement grounded in historical awareness and self-reflection to one focused on rigid control and blind obedience. It argues that what was once a vibrant intellectual tradition has degenerated into dogma and superstition, where genuine critique is replaced by the demand for absolute loyalty and conformity. Quote 97. We are not sure that this theory of autocriticism can justify the autocriticisms Lukács made from 1946 on. Here, the passage expresses doubt about whether the original concept of autocriticism can still apply to the later self-criticisms made by Lukács under political pressure. It suggests that these later admissions of error may not represent genuine intellectual growth, but rather the forced repudiation of previous ideas under the coercive atmosphere of Stalinism. Quote 98. So it is established that Soviet citizens may be deported during an investigation, without judgment or time limit. This quote emphasizes the grim reality that in the Soviet system, citizens could be subjected to indefinite deportation during investigations, with no need for a legal judgment or specified time frame. This lack of due process highlights the arbitrary nature of the Soviet regime's justice system, where individuals were vulnerable to prolonged punishment without formal charges or trials. Quote 99. What we are saying is that there is no socialism when 1 out of every 20 citizens is in a camp. This passage challenges the notion that the Soviet Union can be considered a socialist society when such a large portion of its population is imprisoned in labor camps. The sheer scale of repression contradicts the ideals of socialism, which are based on equality and the well-being of all citizens. The existence of millions in camps reveals a deep flaw in the Soviet system, undermining its claims to socialist principles. Quote 100. If there is one saboteur, spy, or shiftless person for every 20 inhabitants in the USSR, when more than one purge has already purified the country, it is because the system itself unceasingly recreates its opposition. This quote reflects on the paradox of the Soviet purges. Despite repeated efforts to eliminate internal enemies, the system continues to generate new forms of opposition. This suggests that the problem lies within the structure of the regime itself, which perpetuates instability and dissent, rather than in individual acts of sabotage or disloyalty. The ongoing repression is a symptom of deeper systemic issues. Quote 101. If common law prisoners are more trusted men for the regime than political prisoners, it is because it is more pleased with the lumpen proletariat than with the conscious proletarians. This quote criticizes the Soviet regime's preference for aligning itself with common criminals over politically aware prisoners. By favoring the lumpen proletariat, those who are disconnected from political struggle, the regime reveals its distrust of those who are politically conscious and engaged. The passage suggests that the Soviet state sees politically informed individuals as a greater threat than ordinary criminals. Quote 102. The whole system swerves and changes meaning, and in spite of nationalization of the means of production, we wonder what reasons we still have to speak of socialism in relation to it. Here, the passage reflects on the transformation of the Soviet system, where even though the state controls the means of production, the oppressive nature of the regime raises serious doubts about whether it can still be considered socialist. The original ideals of socialism seem to have been lost, replaced by a system that prioritizes control and repression over the well-being and empowerment of its people. Quote 103. Marxism teaches that men make their history. It only adds that they do not make just any history. They operate in situations that they have not chosen and that leave only a limited number of solutions to their choice. This quote captures the Marxist idea that while human beings actively shape history through their actions, they do so within certain constraints. The conditions and contexts in which people operate are not of their own making, which means that their choices are always limited by the broader social, economic, and political structures that surround them. These limitations mean that history is not entirely open to human will, but shaped by forces beyond individual control. Quote 104. If men do not know the history they are not making true history. This quote suggests that there is a disconnect between human actions and the broader historical consequences those actions produce. True history, in this context, refers to an understanding of how one's actions fit into the larger historical narrative. When people act without recognizing the full impact of their choices, they are not truly engaging with history in a meaningful way, but instead, their actions contribute to a historical process that they do not fully understand. Quote 105. Confused ideas and phantasms are not an empire within history's empire. They are part of social dynamics, and it is still social dynamics which is in play through them. This passage emphasizes that even the confused or fantastical thoughts and ideas of individuals are not separate from the historical process, but are instead deeply embedded within it. These ideas, while seemingly irrational, are part of the social and political dynamics that shape history. Rather than viewing such ideas as distractions from history, Marxism sees them as integral to understanding how history unfolds. Quote 106. A philosophical, rigorous, and coherent Marxism admits the plurality of causes in history, deciphers the same dialectic in all of them, and integrates personal conceptions instead of excluding them. This quote acknowledges that history is not driven by a single cause, but by a plurality of factors. A sophisticated Marxist approach recognizes the complex interplay of various causes and integrates personal ideologies, decisions, and actions into the larger historical framework. It shows that personal viewpoints and ideologies are not external to history, but are part of the dialectical process that shapes it. Quote 107. We must choose between the revolution as action and as truth. The true Marxist drama is there, rather than between superstructures and infrastructures, or between men and things. This passage highlights a critical tension within Marxist thought, the choice between seeing revolution as a practical action versus seeing it as an inevitable truth. It suggests that the real struggle in Marxism is not merely between material conditions and ideological superstructures, but in grappling with the practical realities of revolution as an act versus the theoretical certainty that revolution is inevitable. This tension defines much of the drama within Marxist politics. Quote 108. The essence of revolutionary policy lies in the relationship between the proletariat and the party. This quote highlights that the core of revolutionary politics depends on the dynamic between the working class, proletariat, and the political organization, party, that represents it. The success of a revolution hinges on how the party transforms the spontaneous will of the proletariat into organized, strategic action. The proletariat alone may not possess the clear methods or institutions necessary for revolution, which is why the party plays a crucial role in guiding and shaping their actions toward achieving a new social order. Quote 109. Revolutionary action is based upon the two principles that in the last instance the party is always right, and that in the last analysis one is never right in opposition to the proletariat. This passage reflects a central tension in revolutionary movements, the belief that the party, as the political vanguard, knows what is best, but that its legitimacy ultimately depends on its alignment with the proletariat. This creates a delicate balance where the party must simultaneously lead and be accountable to the working class. Both principles are necessary for revolutionary action to succeed, but keeping them in harmony is a constant challenge. Quote 110. There must be a party which accepts the proletarian's criticism as long as it does not set itself up as a second power, clique, or group. This quote underscores the need for the party to remain responsive to the proletariat's concerns and criticisms without becoming a detached elitist entity. The party must listen to the working class while maintaining its role as a unifying force, not dividing itself or forming factions. The revolutionary movement can only thrive if the party stays connected to the people it represents, maintaining a balance between leadership and solidarity with the masses. Quote 111. Even when it intervenes arbitrarily in opposition to union entreaties, it is elections it has to come back to in order to finish the job. This quote illustrates that despite the party's occasional arbitrary interventions, it still must rely on democratic processes to maintain legitimacy. This reflects a fundamental tension in the system. While the party may exercise authoritarian control at times, it cannot completely disregard the will of the proletariat and must return to elections to solidify its actions. This underscores the ongoing negotiation between authoritarian measures and democratic engagement within the revolutionary regime. Quote 112. The system is torn between its two principles. The party is always right, and no one can be right in opposition to the proletariat. Here, the passage points to the inherent contradictions within the system, which constantly oscillates between the authority of the party and the need to remain aligned with the proletariat. This tension is a source of both strength and instability, as the system struggles to reconcile these two competing principles. The survival of the regime depends on navigating this balance, constantly shifting between hardline policies and more consultative approaches to maintain its power. Quote 113. Even had it been up to us, we ought not to have responded to the Hungarian intellectuals' appeal with war. This quote reflects the moral complexity of the Hungarian uprising of 1956, emphasizing that intellectuals and political actors were not in a position to justify military intervention. The focus is on understanding the significance of the intellectuals' sacrifices and interpreting them for a broader audience, rather than escalating violence. The passage suggests that the appropriate response should be thoughtful reflection rather than force, acknowledging the limits of external intervention in such crises. Quote 114. De-Stalinization is not a minor alteration or tactical change in the system, but a radical transformation in which it is risking its life, yet which it must bring about if it is to become honorable again. Here, the quote emphasizes that de-Stalinization represents a fundamental and necessary change within the Soviet system. It is not a superficial reform, but a profound shift that puts the system's survival at risk. However, the transformation is essential for restoring the regime's moral credibility, as it seeks to distance itself from the oppressive practices of Stalin's era and renew its commitment to its foundational ideals. Quote 115. The dictatorship should be animated by the proletariat, or, since the proletariat cannot act in history without an apparatus which reinterprets its mission at each moment, the proletariat should at least recognize itself in its party. This passage critiques the disconnect between the Soviet Communist Party and the proletariat it is supposed to represent. The party must function as the voice and will of the working class, continually reinterpreting its role in response to the needs of the proletariat. When this connection is lost, the party becomes an isolated entity, no longer able to claim its legitimacy as a revolutionary force. Quote 116. The big word in fashion is de-Stalinization. This quote reflects the popularity and widespread use of the term de-Stalinization during the political shifts following Stalin's death. It highlights how this concept became a major talking point in political discourse as the Soviet Union attempted to distance itself from the oppressive practices of the Stalin era. However, the simplicity of the phrase suggests a superficial or trendy approach to a much deeper and more complex issue within the regime. Quote 117. There is no longer any proletarian solidarity, and literally no more communism when a communist power has its whole proletariat against it and crushes it by military means. This quote critiques the fundamental betrayal of communist ideals when a supposed communist regime turns its military power against its own proletariat. The essence of communism, solidarity with the working class, is destroyed when the state suppresses its people, thus calling into question the legitimacy of such a regime's claim to communism. The violent repression of the people signifies a collapse of the core principles that communism is meant to uphold. Quote 118. The break between productivity and planning, between the proletariat and the dictatorship, could not be openly denounced without questioning the essence and philosophy of the regime. This passage addresses the deep contradiction between the regime's theoretical goals and its actual practices. The disconnection between economic productivity and central planning, as well as the divide between the working class and the ruling party, exposes a fundamental flaw in the system. Acknowledging this flaw would force the regime to question its very foundation and guiding philosophy, which it is unwilling to do openly. Quote 119. The system was challenged by being reinforced, and reinforced by being challenged. This quote points to the paradoxical nature of de-Stalinization. While the process ostensibly aimed to reform the Soviet system, it also served to strengthen it by allowing controlled criticism that did not threaten the core structure of the regime. By carefully managing the critique of Stalin and his policies, the Soviet leadership was able to appear responsive to calls for reform while maintaining control over the political system. Quote 120. There are flowers of evil only if there is an evil and a good, and the solicitations of the devil only if there are God's solicitations. This quote reflects the duality present in the concept of eroticism and moral transgression. The idea that flowers of evil can only exist when there is both good and evil implies that acts of transgression, such as eroticism, derive their power and allure from the presence of traditional moral values. Without the framework of good and evil, there is no context for rebellion or the thrill of defiance, underscoring the interdependence of morality and immorality. Quote 121. The eroticism of profanation is too attached to what it denies to be a form of freedom. This passage critiques a certain type of eroticism that is centered on profaning or violating established norms. While such acts may seem rebellious, they are ultimately dependent on the very structures they seek to defy, making them less about true freedom and more about reactionary behavior. The attachment to what is being denied suggests that this kind of eroticism is limited and constrained, rather than liberating or transcendent. Quote 122. Consider the fact that our great erotics always have pen in hand. The religion of eroticism could well be a literary fact. Here, the quote highlights the performative and literary nature of much of eroticism. By pointing out that famous figures associated with eroticism are often writers, the passage suggests that the erotic is often more of a literary creation than a lived reality. The idea of eroticism as a religion speaks to its elevation to a form of worship or obsession, yet it remains something constructed through words and imagination rather than pure experience. Quote 123. A good part of eroticism is on paper. The writer who is not erotic, but more frank and courageous, does not evade any part of his task, which is to change the life of Signs, unaided and all by himself. This passage emphasizes the distinction between literary eroticism and authentic creative effort. Much of what passes for eroticism exists only in written form, a product of imagination rather than genuine experience. In contrast, a truly courageous writer engages directly with the creative process, transforming the life of Signs, that is, the symbols and language used in writing, without relying on the seductive allure of erotic themes. Quote 124. Human life is not played upon a single scale. There are echoes and exchanges between one scale and another, but a given man who has never confronted passions faces up to history. Another who thinks in an ordinary way is free with Moors, and another one who lives to all appearances like everybody else has thoughts which uproot all things. This quote reflects the complexity and variety of human experience. It suggests that people operate on different scales or levels in life, where one person may be passionate in their engagement with history, while another may express freedom through unconventional behavior or deep, transformative thoughts. The passage acknowledges that human existence is multifaceted, and individuals may excel or explore different areas of life in unexpected ways. Quote 125. There is, perhaps, no news item which cannot give rise to deep thoughts. This quote suggests that even the most seemingly mundane or sensational news stories have the potential to provoke profound reflection. The observation highlights how everyday events, often dismissed or consumed passively, can be sources of significant insight if viewed thoughtfully. This notion encourages a deeper engagement with the world, where everything observed, no matter how ordinary, holds the possibility of revealing something important about life or humanity. Quote 126. Seeing is that strange way of rendering ourselves present while keeping our distance and, without participating, transforming others into visible things. This quote reflects on the paradox of observation, especially in the context of witnessing events from a distance. It suggests that when we see something, whether in the media or real life, we are present, yet detached, turning people and their experiences into objects of observation rather than engaging with them as fellow humans. This creates a sense of separation that allows the observer to remain emotionally uninvolved, reducing complex human experiences to mere visual data. Quote 127. The voyeur is sadistic. This brief but powerful statement emphasizes the morally troubling nature of passive observation, particularly when it involves watching others suffer. It suggests that there is a cruelty inherent in voyeurism, where the observer takes pleasure in seeing pain or distress without intervening. This critique of voyeurism highlights the ethical implications of watching from a distance without taking responsibility for what one sees. Quote 128. True little incidents are not life's debris, but signs, emblems, and appeals. Here, the quote elevates the significance of seemingly small, everyday moments. These true little incidents are not insignificant or inconsequential. Rather, they are meaningful events that can reveal deeper truths about life. They serve as symbols or calls to attention, urging us to recognize the importance of the ordinary and the overlooked in our understanding of human existence. Quote 129. The news item is truer because it wounds us and is not pretty to look at. This passage contrasts the rawness of a news story with the more polished and crafted nature of a novel. A news item, with its unfiltered and often unpleasant reality, has the power to confront us with the harshness of life. Its truth lies in its ability to disturb or challenge us, unlike fiction, which can sometimes soften or idealize reality. This suggests that the impact of truth is stronger when it is presented without artifice, even if it is uncomfortable to face. Quote 130. The genius is the man whose words have more meaning than he was able to impart to them himself. This quote suggests that a true genius is someone whose work carries meanings and interpretations beyond their conscious intent. The impact of their words reaches deeper and resonates with others in ways they may not have anticipated. This quality elevates the work of a genius, as it evokes a shared recognition and understanding among readers that transcends the original context of its creation. Quote 131. To speak of genius is to postulate that a man can be cut from the same cloth as what he wrote, and that he produced his writings as an apple tree produces apples. This passage critiques the simplistic notion that a writer's work is a natural and effortless product of their being. The comparison of a writer to a tree producing fruit implies that such an interpretation reduces the complexities of the creative process. Writing is not an organic, automatic act, but one that requires struggle, thought, and labor, and it is incorrect to equate a writer entirely with the works they produce. Quote 132. There is no genius who is continually one. The genius is not a species or race of man. This quote rejects the idea that genius is a constant state or a distinct category of humanity. Genius is a fleeting condition that may appear at certain moments in a person's life or work, but is not an inherent, unchanging trait. The quote demystifies the concept of genius, suggesting it is not a permanent attribute, but something more intermittent and situational. Quote 133. Claudel never disclosed the extent to which he understood others. It is why he raised this rampart of voluntary incomprehension around him. This statement points to Claudel's deliberate distancing from the people around him. Though capable of understanding, he chose to shield himself from others by maintaining an aura of incomprehension or aloofness. This barrier protected him from being fully engaged in the struggles and lives of those who sought his insight, allowing him to keep others at arm's length. Quote 134. The writer himself well knows that there is no common measure between his rumination of his life and the clearest, most readable things it has been able to produce. Here, the passage highlights the dissonance between a writer's lived experiences and the clarity that their work may convey to readers. The process of writing is complex and often personal, and what readers perceive as clear or profound in the work is the result of deep reflection and internal struggle. The quote underscores the idea that the polished final product may not capture the full depth of the writer's personal journey or labor in creating it. Quote 135. The man who takes part in voting gives up his most mature convictions. He agrees that they shall count only as an opinion in the general counting of opinions. This quote reflects a critical view of the voting process, suggesting that by participating in elections, an individual sacrifices the full weight of their convictions. In casting a vote, deeply held beliefs are reduced to mere opinions that become part of a larger collective decision, potentially diluting their significance. The act of voting requires an acceptance that one's beliefs will be subsumed by the majority, which may not align with one's own views. Quote 136. It is not probable that the majority, even among the proletarians, sees necessities which are apparent only to the most disfavored and the best informed. This quote points to the difficulty of revolutionary politics in relying on majority opinion. It suggests that the most oppressed and well-informed individuals may have insights that the general population does not share or understand. The majority, often detached from the harshest realities, may not recognize the urgent needs or solutions required for radical change, making revolution unlikely to emerge from a purely democratic process. Quote 137. If opinions are consulted, there will never be revolution. But if the revolution is never supervised, is it a revolution, a society without exploitation and oppression? This passage captures the paradox of revolutionary movements. On the one hand, consulting the majority opinion may prevent a revolution, as the general population may resist radical change. On the other hand, if a revolution proceeds without checks and balances or oversight, it risks becoming something other than a true liberation from oppression. This tension underscores the challenges of balancing democratic principles with revolutionary aims. Quote 138. The reason why each man meddles in others' business, why he substitutes himself for them, is also that he puts himself in their place, that men do not exist side by side like pebbles, and that each lives in all. This quote emphasizes the interconnectedness of human beings and the impulse to engage with the lives of others. The act of intervening in others' affairs is not merely intrusive, but is rooted in empathy and the ability to relate to their experiences. It reflects a deeper truth about human existence, that individuals are not isolated, but are inherently connected to each other, sharing a common humanity. Quote 139. The majority is not always right, but in the long run, no one can be right in opposition to it. And if someone evades the test indefinitely, it means that he is wrong. This quote presents a nuanced view of the majority's authority. While the majority may not always make the correct decision, it remains a crucial measure of legitimacy. Over time, persistent opposition to the majority without engaging in its processes suggests a fundamental misalignment. The quote suggests that ignoring or avoiding the majority's judgment leads to a loss of credibility, as the collective will ultimately hold sway in determining the course of society. Quote 140. We have made the very concrete observation that after 80 years, we are still badly tolerated occupying authorities in Indochina, that we have failed, and that a military solution would confirm our failure. This quote acknowledges the reality that after decades of colonization in Indochina, the French presence is still resented. Despite the length of their occupation, they have not succeeded in gaining genuine acceptance from the local population. A military solution would only deepen this failure by reinforcing the image of the French as oppressive occupiers rather than benefactors, revealing the futility of continuing their colonial efforts. Quote 141. We say that a Christian is not made to betray his vocation or to excuse those who betray it, and we are not the only ones who are saying it. This passage critiques the moral stance of Christians who support or justify colonialism. It asserts that Christianity, with its teachings of compassion and justice, should not be used as a shield to defend actions that betray these values. The statement condemns those who claim to be Christians, yet fail to oppose or criticize the injustices and violence associated with colonization, urging them to remain true to their moral responsibilities. Quote 142. A French patriotism blew in the direction of humanity. He knew how to judge those in power, but he only asked to be quit of such a tiring lucidity. This quote highlights the internal conflict of individuals like François Mauriac, who once used their sense of patriotism to hold those in power accountable during the war. However, as time passes, there is a desire to move away from the burdensome responsibility of maintaining such clarity and judgment. The quote suggests that this desire to forget and move on leads to a dangerous complacency, especially when it comes to issues like colonialism. Quote 143. The Vietnamese themselves have above all seen the corruption of it. This statement reflects on the Vietnamese experience of French colonization, emphasizing that the local population is more acutely aware of the negative aspects of colonial rule than any idealized version of it presented by the French. For the Vietnamese, the reality of colonization is one of exploitation and oppression, not the civilizing mission that the colonizers might claim to have brought. This perspective underscores the divide between the colonizers' self-image and the colonized people's lived experiences. Quote 144. To be for a military solution is to confirm the 80-year-old French policy in Indochina. This quote argues that advocating for a military approach in Indochina is an endorsement of the long-standing colonial policies that have failed for decades. Continuing down this path not only perpetuates the mistakes of the past, but also reinforces the very dynamics of domination and control that have led to widespread resentment and resistance among the local population. A military solution would merely solidify the legacy of failure in French Indo-Chinese relations. Quote 145. I am unconditionally opposed to repression, and to torture in particular. This quote firmly establishes opposition to any form of repression, especially torture. It reflects a moral stance against inhumane methods of control, emphasizing that such tactics are never justified. Even if terrorism is used as a rationale for torture, the quote insists that the ethical solution would have been to prevent the conditions that led to terrorism in the first place, rather than resorting to brutal practices. Quote 146. Politics is not the contrary of morality, but it is never reduced to morality. This quote emphasizes the complexity of political decision-making, which cannot be purely guided by moral principles. While politics should not contradict morality, it also cannot be entirely defined by it. Political actions involve practical realities and strategic considerations that go beyond simple moral judgments, requiring a balance between ethics and pragmatism. Quote 147. Today, it is fairly clear that the proletariat is not in power in the very countries in which the bourgeoisie has lost power. The very idea of a proletarian power has become problematical. This quote reflects on the shifting nature of revolutionary politics, observing that in many regions where the bourgeoisie has lost power, the proletariat has not risen to take control. The idea of proletarian rule, once central to Marxist thought, is now more uncertain, as political realities diverge from the classical revolutionary narrative. This signals a decline in the revolutionary ideal, as traditionally understood. Quote 148. If we restrict ourselves to what is observable, nothing in Madagascar makes us think of the classical schema of the colonial proletariat which tears through the stages of development without stopping. This passage challenges the conventional Marxist view that colonized countries will rapidly develop a revolutionary consciousness and overthrow their oppressors. The situation in Madagascar, according to the observation, does not fit this model. There is no immediate sense of an uprising or a proletarian movement that is poised to dismantle colonial rule, suggesting that the reality on the ground is more complex than Marxist theory predicts. Quote 149. Independence would not stop, but accelerate the erosion of archaic structures. This quote points out that achieving political independence for a country like Madagascar would not preserve its traditional ways of life. Instead, it would hasten the breakdown of these structures, forcing the country into the challenges of modernization and development. Independence would bring about significant change, but it would not necessarily solve the deeper economic and social problems facing the nation. Quote 150. Politics is not always these stupidities, this laissez-faire, these fits of hysterics, these oaths immediately revoked, these oaths taken in order to negotiate their withdrawal. This quote criticizes the chaotic and contradictory nature of politics, particularly during times of crisis. It highlights the tendency of political figures to act erratically, making promises or commitments only to retract them shortly after. This erratic behavior is seen as a sign of political decadence, where decisions are made impulsively and without long-term consideration, undermining the seriousness of governance. Quote 151. The Algerian officers broke discipline in order to have a government which disciplines them again. This passage reflects the paradox of the Algerian military's actions during the May 1958 crisis. The officers rebelled against the existing government, seeking change, only to call for a new government that would restore discipline and control over them. This irony points to the complex motivations behind their rebellion, where the desire for strong leadership and order ultimately drove their insubordination. Quote 152. General de Gaulle may change the laws. He is not changing the life of France, because that is not the business of one man alone. This quote critiques the over-reliance on General de Gaulle as a singular figure who could resolve France's political and social problems. It suggests that while de Gaulle may implement legal or institutional reforms, he cannot, by himself, transform the fundamental aspects of French society. The quote emphasizes that real change requires more than the actions of one leader. It requires broader engagement and a collective effort. Quote 153. There was never a movement behind de Gaulle in the government because he had no policy, because he arbitrated without governing. This quote points out the limitations of de Gaulle's leadership, particularly his tendency to act as a mediator rather than a proactive policymaker. De Gaulle's ability to maintain power came from his skill in balancing various factions, but he lacked a coherent, forward-looking policy agenda that could galvanize a political movement. This made his leadership effective in managing crises, but insufficient for driving long-term progress. Quote 154. Our present is bounded by phantoms. This is no reason to add to them. This passage reflects on the uncertainty and confusion surrounding the political situation in France during this period. The phantoms symbolize the illusory fears and misjudgments that drive political actions. The quote urges against compounding these fears by creating more illusions or false narratives, suggesting that clear thinking and pragmatism are needed to navigate the crisis, rather than indulging in further political myths or manipulations. Quote 155. It is not by chance that several months before the rebellion, the 5th Bureau of Algiers got an operating plan of the radio station. This quote points to the premeditated nature of the rebellion in Algiers, revealing that military elements had planned in advance to take control of communication infrastructure. This preparation suggests a deeper conspiracy behind the rebellion, aimed at using media and radio to control the narrative and manipulate public perception. It underscores the strategic thinking behind the rebellion and its focus on controlling information. Quote 156. War will no longer be, is no longer, a visible war. It will be, or rather it is, a clandestine war. This quote reflects on the changing nature of warfare, moving away from conventional battles to a more covert and subtle form of conflict. The idea of a clandestine war points to a world where power struggles happen behind the scenes, through subversion and manipulation rather than open confrontation. This type of warfare is harder to detect and fight, making it more insidious and dangerous in the modern political landscape. Quote 157. The soldier's job has been changed, that's all. We are waging a war which is imposed upon us. A war without rules. A war without honor. A plebeian war. This passage highlights the brutal and dehumanizing reality of modern conflict, where soldiers are no longer fighting traditional wars with clear rules of engagement. Instead, they are involved in a ruthless, unstructured conflict that lacks the noble qualities often associated with warfare. The description of it as a plebeian war emphasizes the lack of glory or heroism, turning the soldier's role into one of sheer survival and obedience rather than honor. Quote 158. We must not, Pierre Debray says, draw back at integrating the army and the police. This quote reveals the growing convergence between the military and police forces, blurring the lines between maintaining law and order and engaging in military conflict. It speaks to the militarization of civilian spaces and the willingness to use military tactics in domestic governance. This integration reflects a broader shift towards authoritarian control, where state forces become indistinguishable in their efforts to suppress dissent. Quote 159. All this is a fascism in the most precise sense of the term, revival and external imitation of the methods of revolutionary struggle. This statement critiques the adoption of revolutionary tactics by authoritarian regimes, labeling it as a form of fascism. It points to the way these regimes mimic the methods of revolutionaries, such as propaganda, violence, and mass mobilization, but do so for the purpose of suppressing freedom rather than achieving liberation. This co-opting of revolutionary methods by fascists turns the tools of resistance into instruments of oppression. In Signs, Maurice Merleau-Ponty leaves us with a profound meditation on the human condition, insisting that truth, language, and perception are not fixed entities but dynamic processes intertwined with history and experience. His phenomenological inquiry reveals the limitations of pure reason and objective science in capturing the depth of human existence. Instead, Merleau-Ponty encourages us to embrace the complexity and ambiguity inherent in life. The book's essays reinforce his belief that understanding ourselves and the world requires an ongoing engagement with the visible and invisible dimensions of experience. Through his exploration of language, politics, and the body, Signs reminds us that human freedom is both a promise and a challenge, unfolding through the perpetual negotiation between individual existence and the broader social and historical forces at play.
Curious to dive into the mind of Maurice Merleau-Ponty? With StudyLab Pro's book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of signs in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.